Welcome to the Covert Access Team podcast. Today we're digging into a question that's deceptively tricky in physical security testing. How do you know when you're done? Whether you're running a pen test, audit, or hybrid engagement, the line between thorough and overkill isn't always obvious. Here to help us break that down is CAT Chief Instructor Brian Harris. Let's start with the basics. Why is it difficult to define finished?
So it can be really difficult to understand when you're done, mostly because you first have to understand what exactly are you, like, why does the client want you there in the first place? So here's an example from pen testing. Assume your client tells you that the motivation for hiring your team to run a penetration test is that the facility manager or the CTO or the CISO or somebody high up has an opinion that they have a massive security problem and they need to convince the board of directors that next year the budget should be increased so that all of these security issues can be resolved. Okay, so that's the opinion of one, say they're a board member, say it's the CISO, but he's having trouble convincing the rest of the board. And he says, well, the reason why I want you to come in is I want you to come in, run a penetration test to show them how bad things could be. All right, so you've been given an objective of breaching server rooms, VIP board meeting room, whatever. You have a couple stated goals. Awesome. But one of the really important things is you also understand his motivation. His motivation is we need to make the board of directors understand that this is a serious concern. All right. So basically, when you're running a penetration test, you have two options. During your recon phase, you're going to discover probably a dozen or so different possible routes into the building. Maybe some of them are tailgating, maybe some of them are trying to clone a badge, maybe some of them are scaling the building up to the second, third, or fourth story so that you can gain access to a window or rear door. Maybe some of them are picking a lock or shimming it, whatever. So you have a whole bunch of potential entry points. But given the client's motivation, getting caught is a catastrophic, cannot be allowed to happen, worst case scenario thing, because even if you manage to get in, but if you get caught, the board of directors may turn around and say, well, this isn't really a big deal because we caught the bad guy. So, people don't care if you breach a building. They don't. Most people could get into 90% of facilities, buildings, etc. with a brick. Right? You throw a brick through a window, you walk inside, okay, you're in. They don't care about that. If you throw a brick through a police station and you walk inside and you're in handcuffs in 5 seconds, well, they're going to look at that as a win for their security, right? They don't look at that as like, oh, but he actually physically got in. What they care about is, what did you do after you got in? Did you have persistence? Meaning, did you come and go as you pleased for 6 months, or was it a one-time thing? And what did you do, and were you ever caught? Those are the things they actually care about. And then, of course, if you accomplish the things that they're wanting you to do. So in this particular instance, given what the client has set out for you, breach the building, accomplish these objectives, but his motivation is, I need to scare the board of directors into understanding the sheer catastrophic effect of what would happen if someone broke in. Okay, then given that, you should never try the routes that you've discovered that are high risk to getting caught. You should begin and end with your most probable, likely to succeed route, and when that's finished, game over. Because that will accomplish exactly what you set out to do. Now, the upshot is, the positive, is that you did exactly what the client wanted. The downside is, this is by no means a thorough security examination.
But the goal is more money to perform a more thorough security examination after hardening their security in the ways that the CISO wants.
Right, exactly. Now, take that in contrast. What if the CISO comes to you and says, well, we want you to do a thorough penetration test, right? We really want to test our security, right? That's the literal motivation here is, I want to see what our security, like how it is currently. Okay, well, if that's the motivation, then finished in this case is, we need to identify every possible route we have, starting with the most likely to succeed, least likely to get us caught, and ending with the stupidest, loudest, dumbest thing that's most likely to get us caught and least likely to succeed, and try them all, right? Because if the motivation here is, we just want a robust security test, okay, well then getting caught is not that big of a deal, right? They're not, they genuinely want you to, they want to understand what is their current security posture. Okay, so start off with the most likely to succeed thing, and then end with the loudest, dumbest, walk into the front door and wave at the secretary and smile and see if she buzzes you in kind of thing, right? So, but when you are finished can greatly change. These are two different penetration tests, potentially for the same client, but given the client's motivation for hiring you, when you are done is very different.
Gotcha. So assuming the client knows exactly what they want from you as you guys are, mutually scoping the engagement, how do you define finished before the engagement begins?
So as I mentioned, one of the most important things right up front is to understand his motivation. So because when you're having that scoping meeting, when you're having that initial back and forth with your prospective client, you need to understand, why are you hiring me? And then when they give you the motivation and they've chosen either a penetration test or an audit, and you've explained the pros and cons of both, then you help them and say, okay, given this test and given your motivation, I would recommend this is how we proceed, and then allow them to have a back and forth with you, right? And you need to hash all of that out ahead of time, because if you don't, say that the client tells you right up front that our biggest concern is scaring the board of directors. Okay, you might assume as a professional who's done this before, okay, well, we will do our one best route and stop. But what if that's not what the client had in mind? What if the client told you that this was we want you to scare the board of directors, but we also obviously want a thorough security test. We're paying you for this, right? If you don't understand that, if you don't hash that out with them, well, then you're going to finish the test wildly before he was assuming you'd finish the test. And if he gives you 2 weeks to run an engagement and you end it on Friday night of the first week, well, what are you doing for another week, right? This gets into another question. So it's understanding when you are finished is actually it's not only a very important thing to consider, but it's also something that can be very ambiguous. I'll give you another example. Suppose that you're running an audit. You're going through and you think that you've got everything, right? You think that you have mapped everything out. You found all the vulnerabilities you have. And then you discover something. You discover something that you didn't think about or you didn't know about. Say your audit goes for 1 week. And on Thursday, you're, wrapping things up and you're, testing the last few things that you have to test. And it's only that day that a third-party vendor comes in for the first time since you've been auditing. And you discover that this third-party vendor has a master key to the entire building. And upon asking them questions of like, where did you get the master key and who gave it to you? They say, oh, I don't even remember. And they say something like, well, do you know if there's more master keys? And they said, oh yeah, I think they had a bunch, but I don't know who has them or where or anything else. And you go back to the client, you ask them about this, and they have no idea what you're talking about.
Sure.
Right. Okay, so you just opened up a whole can of worms that without happening across that one third-party vendor, you'd never know it. You'd never know any of this was a possible attack route. And so understanding, especially with auditing when you are finished, can be a huge pain in the butt.
And that brings up a good question, because obviously when you're finished is largely defined by achieving the objectives from the client. However, it's also defined by however much time the client is willing to pay you for.
Correct.
So let's say you have the client who says, we want the robust, test everything. You've got 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you prioritize and you do all the things that you can. And then for the things that you didn't have time to do, you include them in the report and make further recommendations, perhaps for a follow-up test. Is that kind of how you would approach it if the time duration kind of caps your capacity to actually be, quote, done?
Well, so kind of. So you always do basically a best effort type of thing, right? Like it's never possible to be 100% thorough on anything because things change. However, given that, you should always try to scope an engagement for as close to 100% as you possibly can. So if you think
100% of their goal.
Yes, well, 100% of their goal and what also you bring to the table. And that's what I mean by that is the vast majority of clients do not fully understand what they need or what they want. Most clients that I deal with want the James Bond penetration test, not because it's what they need. It's because it's what they think they need. They want a person to sneak into the building and bug the entire office and put calling cards places and all these kinds of things and really impress the board of directors or whoever. And it's like, okay, I can do that. But why? What are you getting out of it? Now ask yourself this question to all the businesses out there, anybody who's listening to this, who's a business owner or who works for a major organization. When was the last time your organization had an actual physical pen test? The overwhelming majority of you will fall into one or two categories, which is A, we've never had one, or B, I think we had one about 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. And that's usually about how that goes. So as a result, if you have not had a penetration test in that long, chances are you need an audit. You don't need a pen test. You need an audit. And this gets into the fundamental difference of a pen test and an audit, is that a penetration test is testing your current security posture. How easy is it for a bad guy to either sneak into the building or an insider threat to move around the building and accomplish something, depending on how you want to go about this? And now, okay, here's the realistic aspects of this. You will not find everything because that's not your goal. On a penetration test, I'm probably never going to find all the vulnerabilities you have because I'm not looking for all the vulnerabilities you have. I'm looking for the easiest, most effective routes into the building and then how I can get persistence. That's what I'm looking for. With an audit, however, your stated goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as possible, and then from those vulnerabilities, piece together routes. Now, these are very different approaches, and they accomplish very different things. But if your current security is crap, you've never had a penetration test, or the last one you had was a decade ago, then chances are, what I hear most clients say is, well, we don't know why we should hire you for a penetration test because we know that you could get in. Yes, exactly. If then you fall in that category, right? You've probably not had a pen test ever, or it's been a decade. And the reason why you know that a bad person can sneak into the building is because you could do it. Anyone could do it. And your current security is, we really hope nobody does.
Sure.
So that's the whole point. So most clients need an audit before they need a pen test to identify all the weaknesses, all the potential routes, and then bring their security up to a high level. Then later, if they want to actually come back and test things, you can. But again, going back to the concept of the topic of this discussion, when are you done? I mean, when are you done with an audit? How do you know when you've found 100% of all the vulnerabilities? It's tough.
So why is it so hard to know when you're done with an audit?
Well, okay, let's go back to a pen test. With a pen test, the vast majority of clients have one of two reasons why they've hired you. Either they're trying to get more money for something, next year, physical security, something like that. Or B, they genuinely want to test their current security. Okay, well, given those two things, you have a very clear set of goals. If it's trying to scare the board of directors into a larger budget, don't get caught. Do the absolute best case scenario, likely to get you in, least likely to get you caught method, and then probably you're finished. If it's to genuinely test their security, then go all out. Test every possible route and method you can think of, starting with the most likely to succeed and ending with the least likely. But with an audit, your goal is to find every last vulnerability. Well, how do you know when you're done, right? That's a very, very difficult thing to do because, there's an infinite number of possible attack routes, from insider threats, outsider threats, vendor threats, all kinds of things. So like here's, you come in and you say, well, I've assessed all the vulnerabilities. Great, you've assessed all the vulnerabilities. And you say, I've assessed how any bad person could sneak into the building, and we've hardened all of those. Great, awesome. But what about insider threats? Okay, these are people who already have access to the building. Have you considered that? Have you walked through the possible things? And what if it's not just the employees? What if it's a third party, like a janitor? What if it's a third party, like a cook? What if it's a third party, like a delivery guy? What if So here's a common one. I've seen this happen many times before, and people don't even think about it when you're running an audit. You come in, you do an audit. You check, the external security. You check, is it a flat physical network? You check, can everybody go to any place? You check the cleaners and you see what they have access to, and maybe even you show up after hours to chat with them, or you kind of watch them, how they go about things. Okay, great. You've done all those things. But what happens if a package doesn't get delivered in the time that you're auditing? But when a package is delivered, the secretary just says, oh yeah, because I know the delivery guy, just wave them through and have the package get dropped off in the back where we drop off all the packages. Well, if you aren't physically there for that thing to have happened, you're not going to see it. And as a result, well, that's definitely a potential security issue. If the delivery guy just walks in with a box and they wave them through security so they can take the box to wherever, the person normally drops it off, that's a huge problem. But if you're not physically there to see that happen, well, you didn't catch it.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit more about some other common mistakes that people make when they, might prematurely declare themselves done?
Yeah, so the biggest one, by far, the biggest mistake that you are going to find is not understanding the motivation of the client. Because again, go back to the pen test thing, right? The pen test thing is a lot easier. Is there motivation that you don't get caught and scare the board, or is there a motivation that you genuinely test all of their security in its current setup? If you don't know the motivation, you genuinely have no idea, chances are you will err towards the side of caution. Well, then you're probably going to get it wrong because you've got a 50-50 shot. Well, maybe not probably, but you're likely to get it wrong. You get a 50-50 shot, roughly. Do you pick the right one?
And I guess that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess that comes down to during the scoping meetings, just really asking your client a lot of questions to maybe even get to the underlying objective that they may not even understand.
Well, exactly. That's actually where I was headed to, was that the clients often don't know what they need or what they want, right? And that's your job. Your job is not only to accomplish what they want, but also to help them understand what they need. So I was recently on a job where the client had put aside a very large budget for a cyber pen test. And when the concept of a physical addition to this was brought up, they had no idea. They were like, well, why would we do that? Why would we add a physical component? And after explaining to them that if somebody were to break in and walk to their secure area, their server room or whatever else, there is no security at that point, right? If I've got a bash bunny standing in front of an unlocked server rack, then chances are I can do anything I want to do. So, and I've bypassed all the cyber defenses that you've put into place. But here was the thing. Once I explained to them what was going on with all of this and why it was potentially dangerous, then they didn't know what they wanted. Then all of a sudden they just said, okay, well, yeah, just add the physical thing to the test. Add a physical component to a cyber test.
Sure.
Okay, but am I testing everything? Am I testing one route? This is why you have to be very cautious. You have to be very careful about what is the motivation of your client. And it will change as you go on. Because the client may think there's no possible way they're going to get to this location. But what if you do? Do you keep going? Do you push it farther? Say I was relatively recently on a very, very high security job, and the client was absolutely 100% confident I would not get to a very secure location. I did. And then imagine being at a secure location, cameras, guards, people everywhere, and in that moment you have to call the client and say, hey, I got to the place you said I wouldn't get to. Can I go farther? Sure. In the middle of trying to blend in and do all these kinds of things, you have to stop what you're doing and say, well, can I do this? And that all came about because the client wouldn't give me a definitive answer, because the client said, well, if you get that far, we have to go up the chain and we have to actually ask, can we do this? But we don't think you're actually going to do that.
So we'd rather not bother them right now.
We'd rather not bother our boss's boss's boss. So let's just, if you get that far, let's bring it up then, right? So this is a tricky situation, right? So now go back to that. Are you done? The client has said, get to this location. You got to that location. Are you finished? Well, maybe But maybe the client actually wants you to see if you can go farther. Can you get inside? Can you put a sticker somewhere? Can you, whatever they like. Well, that's the question, right? So you need that back and forth constant communication with the client. But it's also really important why you have a teammate who is in direct communication at all times with the client, so that you can communicate what you're doing and you don't have to directly be standing in front of a secure door with guards walking all around on the phone with the client asking them, hey, can I try to break into this building that I'm not, or room that I'm not supposed to be in?
And even determining the those key critical points is probably a conversation with the client. They know what is critical to their business. You have a lot of experience, so you may know what's critical to their business, but if they're, for example, manufacturing some really unique item, or it may be novel to you as well, and that's why it really needs to be a conversation.
No, it absolutely does. There was an instance that I did years ago where the client asked me to break into a corporate environment, and while doing my reconnaissance, so basically the client said, our goal, the thing that we want, the thing that we're most concerned about is that somebody breaks into the corporate environment and does something in the wing of this headquarters with the board of directors. Plants a bug in the VIP meeting room, gets access to something they shouldn't. Okay, that's what the client told us that they were interested in. During the recon phase, we discovered that this corporate office was actually connected to this big factory. Now, we knew what their business was. We knew that they were a factory, but the factory, as far as the client was concerned, was not in scope. It was just the corporate environment, the headquarters area. Well, during reconnaissance, we noticed a big, scary-looking robot that was running around inside of their factory. And when we asked the client what that was, they told us that this robot, basically the factory was built around the robot. And I obviously made the question of okay, what would happen if the robot went away? What happens if something bad happens to the robot? To which they responded, they said, well, if the robot goes away or the robot is damaged in some way, shape, or form, we would not be able to get the robot up and running again, potentially. And our business, we may go out of business if that robot is offline for 3 months. Okay, so that drastically changes what might be important to this client. Because if I can break into the warehouse where they're doing all the factory stuff and I can mess with this robot and I can do something to it that would make it go offline, for 3 months, well, then their entire business goes out. Is that more important or less important than breaking into the corporate environment?
Sure.
I don't know. But that's, the client doesn't always know what they need. They don't always understand these things. And so one of the aspects of your job is to help them understand it.
Now, that's a really good example of, understanding the client's needs, but what are some other issues that you have in terms of trying to understand their needs?
So one of the bigger issues is where the client is purposefully, let me rephrase this. One of the biggest issues is where you don't have a client, but you have multiple clients. So this often happens when instead of having a contact, like a client contact, you have 4 or 5, where you have the client contact, the technical guy, the board of directors guy, you have 4 or 5 people. And when you try to ask, and oftentimes what they'll do is we'll create a chat for all of us to talk. And then anytime you ask a question, they'll have different opinions.
Sure.
And it's okay, well, I kind of need the answer to this. It has to be a yes or no. It can't be this gray area nebulous thing. Because one position you never want to find yourself in is when you finished a test, audit, pentest, whatever, and you're giving the report to the client, and somebody in the board of directors or somebody in that meeting room says, that's not what we wanted. Why did you do that? We didn't authorize you to do it. That's by far the last thing you want to happen. And so it's really important that you get a hard yes or no on everything you're going to do. So, here's an example. I was, relatively recently, I was inside a CEO's office, and I found that he had a safe. I knew that I could get in this safe. That safe was not in any of my documentations. The client himself did not know this safe existed. The client contact. Mm-hmm. Can he give me authorization to go into it? Well, technically he can, but, kind of. But
he might lose his job.
He might lose his job. But the issue is that, are you done? You found the safe. You know that you can get into this safe. And on your scope of work, it says, try to get in and see what vulnerabilities you have or what vulnerabilities you find. So in this particular instance, my rules of engagement literally said, once you get into this area, as long as you don't break anything or take anything off premise that's sensitive, you have access to do whatever you want. But then it's really important that, okay, should you ask the client contact, hey, there's this safe in the CEO's office. Can I go into it? I mean, technically, your rules of engagement say you can, but I definitely encourage you to ask. But that gets back to the question, when are you done, right? Is breaking into the safe done? Or is it just saying like, hey, I took a picture of this. I mean, that's done.
Can you share a time when you thought you were done, but you actually weren't?
Yeah, so in this example, so the one that comes to my mind, I'm doing an audit. So I'm walking through the building, and audits are usually done semi-covert. So what that means is, so for example, you want to test everything about the building, the location, and that includes social engineering. That includes, the employees' awareness. That includes how, are they holding the doors open for people? Are they leaving badges around? You're testing everything. So it's not wise during an audit to announce who you are, because if you announce who you are to every employee, they're going to be on their best behavior. You're not going to notice things, right? So this is where it comes into semi-covert. So you show up to the facility, 9 in the morning or whatever, and you say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'd like a badge. You get a badge, you walk through the building. But you don't tell everybody who you are. But in this case, I'm running an audit, and I happen across I think he was an electrician. He might have been a plumber, but he was a third party. And he tells me, he's helping me to get through a door, and he tells me that the key, he asks me the question, do you want a copy of this key so you can get in here? And I said, well, I probably don't need to come back in here after I've, this one time. And he says, oh, no. This key opens every door in the building. Now I asked him, I said, okay, so you have a master key? And he said, yeah, I have a master key. And I said, why do you have two? Because he offered me one. And he said, oh, well, I lost them, once, and so I made a couple copies.
Oops.
Because these were physical keys, right? And I asked him, I said, well, is there any inventory of how many you have or who gave them to you? He says, oh, I don't know. So I went and asked the client. I said, are you aware of the master key thing? He says, oh, yeah, we have master keys that we give out to all third parties. So they can come in and they can access what they need to access. And I said, are you aware that some of them can and have even been copied? And he says, oh, well, we've never thought about that. I said, do you have an inventory of who has these keys? And they said, no. Okay, well, that opens up an entire different discussion, right? The fact, one, that master keys to the building exist. Two, that you've been handing them out like candy to every third-party contractor. And three, every third-party contractor, from janitors to electricians to plumbers to everybody who comes into the building, has a key that will open every single door to the building. And a good portion of these people know the codes to the alarms if they're coming in after hours. That's a problem, right? So, yeah, I learned of this towards the very end of an assignment. But again, I would never have known this had I have not bumped into that guy. Because I asked the client, is there anything I should know? Master keys or anything else? He didn't understand. Now, this was my fault, but he didn't understand what a master key was. And even though I described it to him in the moment, he didn't think of it. He didn't put it together when I said a master key that opens all the doors. He says, no, we use access control. We use cards. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, so you use cards. Great. But when I talked to him about the electrician, and I said, hey, you have an electrician here who has a physical key to every door. He goes, oh, yeah, that's and he referred to it as that's the contractor's key. And that's how he understood it. So when I told him, do you have asked him questions, do you have master keys, anything else, physical keys that override the access control systems? He says, no, we just all use cards.
Well, he was probably only thinking about employees.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly, right? And so had I have not actually talked to this guy, I might not have discovered that. But this was towards the end of an audit, and that opened up an entirely new, huge, security issue where you're like, okay, so there's an unknown number of keys. There's an unknown number of people who have these keys, and they access everything. So, yeah, problem.
There's one thing that I've seen, particularly with sort of people who don't have a lot of experience with physical pen testing, where they kind of do these, I guess you could call them sucker punches or kind of gotcha gambits. Sure. And, it works, but it's so cheap.
Sure.
What do you think about those?
Right. Okay. So I'll describe an instance where I've used this before, and then I'll describe when I think it's valuable and when I don't.
Okay.
So So the one that comes to mind is we had a teammate, female, who was wearing a red dress, walked into the lobby of an organization carrying a whole bunch of fake spreadsheets and documents and things like this. So you have a woman who's dressed very well. She's wearing a bright red dress to attract people's attention. She walks inside and she quote unquote trips and scatters the papers everywhere, right?
Sure.
Okay, great. Now, humorously, she actually practiced tripping for like half a day to, one, make sure she didn't hurt herself, but two, to make sure it looked convincing, because you see someone fake trip. It's
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, that was kind of a funny instance, but. So she trips, she scatters papers everywhere. People come out and they try to help her. And in that moment, we hop a turnstile and bypass security and things, because there's actual guards in the lobby and we needed them to not be looking at their post. Okay, great. So that worked. Now, the problem with that is that is a gotcha. That is the Matrix woman in a red dress, literally. But that's a snapshot of what's the recommendation for your client in that regard? What do you recommend?
Sure.
Well, if something crazy happens, never look, never look away or something, or install turnstiles that can't be hopped, or whatever. So when you're doing these types of things, you really need to test. You really need to ask yourself, is the client going to get any benefit from doing this part of the test? Or is it just one of those things that it's like, yeah, it's fun to do and it's fun to add in the report, but there's no benefit. So in this particular instance, the client specifically asked us to do things that would draw guards away from their post. So in this particular case, the client, one of their things was that they were concerned. They were personally concerned. They had told me that one of the things that they were concerned about was that they had hired third-party security to actually stand guard at certain checkpoints. And the person who hired us, the client contact, said on many occasions we have personally witnessed the third-party security just kind of being on their phone, goofing off, not really doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Wandering off.
Well, yeah, going to the bathroom for extended periods of time, things like this. And so that was literally part of the test. But if it hadn't been, and we had used this in Hop the Fence or something, it's like, yeah, okay, it's interesting. It's something that, you can use it to get inside. Great, it works. But what do you recommend to the client afterwards, right?
Sure.
If you're running some kind of like gotcha distraction and you're like, oh, haha, look over here, and then you do something, that's interesting. But what is the probability that somebody's actually going to use this to get in? Very small. And even if we had done the exact same ploy 2 or 3 times, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work 2 or 3 times over, right? So because it worked once doesn't mean it's going to work a second time. So this isn't like a persistent way of getting inside. This is like,
and in fact, the next time it happens, people are going to be like, what?
Right, exactly, right? So this is one of those things that it might genuinely be a one-off. Like, okay, that's interesting. It worked the one time, but, it may not work twice.
Sure. Another challenge to the concept of being done really comes down to the skills of the penetration testing team, or, the auditor, or if it's a solo pen test, as we know is very common, you may only have certain skills, so you may only be able to test certain things. So when the concept of done is limited by your own skills, what do you do then?
Right. So this is an excellent question, because let's suppose for a moment you're on a solo engagement, which means the skill sets that you can rely on are literally just yours. Now let's assume that you know how to clone an access card and you are somewhat proficient at social engineering, but those are the only 2 skills that you have. Okay. Any possible route that
the flipper and a smile mentality.
Basically, yes. So you have a flipper and a smile. But any possible route that relies on scaling the building, lock picking, bypassing alarms, or anything like that are now off the table, because you personally don't have the skills to do those things, which means that even if, say, the server room is on the 5th floor and there's a fire escape that starts on the 2nd or 3rd floor, that if you could climb up to it and climb up to the 5th floor, there's a window to the server room that's wide open. Okay, that's definitely a vulnerability. But if you don't have the skills and the confidence to do that, it's not even an option to you, right? So it doesn't matter that now it should definitely go in the report, But it doesn't matter that that's a route. It just matters the fact that you don't have the skills. So it's an excellent question of when are you done, right? So when the concept of being done is, a lot of it should entail, anything you don't test, in my opinion, should always go in the report if you see it. So in this instance, you see a fire escape or a catwalk or something on the server room window is open or something, but you don't have the physical chops to get up there on, scale the building. Okay, you can't do it, but definitely take a picture of it and put it in the report and say, hey, look, I think that this is a big problem. But again, if you don't, let's say that you're running a pen test and you identify 5 possible routes into the building. And the client has said, we want you to test every route you discover, right? The motivation here is just a robust test of our security. But 3 of those routes rely on skill sets you do not possess. Well, then you can't test them. As a result, being done is limited literally because you've identified several different routes that you could test, but you can only test 2 because you don't have the skills to do anything else. And skill sets alone are not the only option here. What if you are a master? What if you're literally Iceman and you are the master of RFID cloning, but you find yourself on a pen test with no RFID cloning gear?
Sure.
Okay, great. You're the master of this domain, right? You can pick any lock in existence except you don't have a lockpick.
Sure.
Well, okay, that sucks for you. So you are always going to be limited based on your skill sets and based on the equipment you have at your disposal. So when you are trying to figure out when are you done, well, okay, if it's a 2-week engagement and the second Tuesday or Wednesday comes along and you still have 2 routes that you haven't tested but you don't have the chops to do it, then you're probably done. But that doesn't mean that it's difficult, right? You need to convey to the client that, yeah, okay, we're not going to pen test this. And this gets into a whole different awkward conversation where you try to explain to the client, well, there was this, I could have, it looks like if you scaled the side of the building, that might have been a route, but I didn't do it. And the client's going to say, why?
Sure.
And then you're going to have to come back and say, well, it's because I can't. I can't lockpick. I can't do this. I can't scale the building. I can't, that's going to be an awkward conversation.
Which is all the more reason to kind of all of those potential gaps in your skills, fill them up as you can.
Well, yes, or ideally be with a team.
Sure.
Ideally, be with a team who each person has some series of skills so that as a team, you have a complete range of skill sets.
Sure. And, talking about the report, bringing the report and saying, oh, we didn't test these things. Are you done once the report is in the hands of the client?
So yes and no. So depending on how the project was scoped, you might be officially done, but realistically, no. So what often will happen is that you give the client a report, audit, pen test, whatever. You're going to give a series of recommendations. And arguably, you should be giving a series of recommendations. Do not ever just go with the gold standard, because oftentimes it's not going to be viable, it's not going to be feasible, it's not going to be affordable, it's not going to be actionable. So if you tell the client, well, every door interior needs to be hardened steel and it needs to have, a PIMCO under door anti-bypass device. Sure, you could argue that, but they're not going to. And it's way too much money, right? So you need to give them kind of all right, here's the gold standard of what I recommend, but if you can't do this, try this. If you can't do that, try this, etc. And kind of walk them down. But there's almost assuredly going to be a back and forth, right? Because it's going to take time and effort to fix the things that you've discovered. So you give the client the report. It's going to take time for them to actually implement any remediations that you've discovered. But they might have questions like, hey, we noticed that vulnerability number 17, you said to do this, but when we tried, it's not working, or the thing that you recommended doesn't really fit in this hardware. So could you help us with something else? So yeah, oftentimes there's going to be kind of a back and forth. And just to the pen testers out there, I highly recommend keeping that good rapport with the client, because they often will. They often will come back and ask you a lot of follow-up questions, because of course they will, right? It's kind of like if you go to the doctor and he gives you a medication or prescription and he says hey, do this thing. Chances are, if it doesn't clear up immediately, you will ask follow-up questions. So similarly, if you give remediation to a client and you've got 50 different vulnerabilities that you've discovered, chances are they're going to have follow-up questions.
Sure. Now, within the context of being done, is there anything that we should discuss that we haven't talked about already?
Well, I mean, let's go through what I would consider to be the best way to run an audit, because this is a lot of times people, in my opinion, the vast majority of clients need an audit. They don't need a pen test. Well, they don't need a pen test yet.
Sure.
So a pen test is what you do, arguably, when you actually want to legitimately test the current security. But if you've never had a pen test, or it's been 10 years or something else, then the only real motivation you should have is we're trying to scare the board of directors into more money, right? That's usually the only real reason you should do this. In the same way that there's no reason why you should pay, if you're running the latest, greatest patched version of Windows 7, there's no reason why you should pay $5,000 for a pen test on it.
Sure.
That's ridiculous, right? You need somebody to come in and tell you how to upgrade your system, not to come in and see if Windows 7 is actually patched correctly.
Sure.
So given that, when you're running an audit, the best way to do this, in my opinion, is to have a client contact, but set somebody up as you're running the audit. Because remember, audits are semi-covert. So the most common way that I've ran audits in the past is you run the audit, you give the client a report full of remediations, they go and do the things, right? However, the ideal way to do it is that while you're on site, while you're doing the things, you periodically grab the client and walk him through exactly what you've discovered, exactly what you found, and exactly how to fix it. And then, ideally, they fix it then and there. If they have a facility manager, if they have somebody who's on-site, physical security, and they can actually replace and install and update and things as you go along, it's perfect. Because I have been on jobs before where I've told people, hey, this door is super important and it needs to be fit, and this needs to be fixed. And then they come in and they fix it, but they don't quite do it right. And then you can come back and say, I see what you did, but you've made a mistake, and here's how you fix the mistake that you've made.
Sure.
Which is, again, it's far better, because then you avoid that awkwardness of 6-7 months later when somebody says, hey, look, you told us to fix this door in this way, we did, and there's an issue, there's still a problem. So yes, it's much better when you're running audits if you can have somebody on site and walk them through what you're doing, when you're doing it, and things like that, because oftentimes they can fix things pretty quick. You don't need really robust security features. And this gets back to a different question. When you are running either pen tests or audits, always ask the question, is my client actually getting benefit out of this? Are they actually going to get any usefulness out of this? So, and if so, how do I fix it? Before you actually go to the client and say, hey, I found a vulnerability, figure out, one, is it actually important? And two, how would you fix it before you go to the client? Because what I've seen a lot of times, especially with people who are running audits for the first time, is they just flood the client with 500 different vulnerabilities. None of them are prioritized. None of them are ranked based on most or least severe, and they have no remediations. And the client just is completely overwhelmed. They don't know what to do or where to start, right? So if you find 5 vulnerabilities, and you find from those 5 vulnerabilities you can make a viable attack route, right? I can go from the outside to the server room by exploiting these 5 different vulnerabilities. Is there any one of those vulnerabilities that you could resolve in a cheap, effective way that breaks that attack route? Right? So it's one of those things that something like that. So you can go to the client, you can say, hey, look, we found these 5 vulnerabilities. Here's the route. You can literally walk them through. We're going to exploit this, and then we'll be into your server room. Okay. But if we fix this one thing on vulnerability number 2, which will cost you $100, the entire attack route goes away. Right.
Sure.
So it's something like this. And of course, you're going to encourage your clients to fix everything. Of course you will. But if you can figure out what the bottlenecks are, and you can say, okay, just if you fix vulnerability number 2 out of 5, that entire attack route basically disappears and it's not possible to, use it anymore. Okay, great. They're going to love you for that, because then they don't have to say, okay, well, fuck, I've got to, solve all these things simultaneously. It's like, no, you just solve this one thing and then the route goes away. Now, the other thing that I wanted to discuss before we kind of go away is the fundamental difference between insider and outsider threats. Because one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest mistakes that I see is where pen testers or auditors, they only prioritize threats from the outside. Basically, this idea of a guy in a balaclava or a ski mask breaking in the middle of the night trying to get to somewhere. It's like, yeah, okay, that type of breaching is usually only viable for merchants, right? An Apple store, an iPhone store, a laptop store. The types of people that you're going to actually be concerned with breaking in the middle of the night with ski masks and stuff are usually going to be clients who have merchandise that they're going to get stolen.
Sure.
And then it really just comes to perimeter security and then kind of a smoke deterrent or, that type of thing.
To, reach the average police response
time. Right, exactly. And that, of course, right? If the police response time is 30 minutes, then you need to delay them 30 minutes. If it's 10 minutes, you need to delay them 10 minutes, that sort of thing. However, the vast majority of threats that you're going to actually be concerned about are insider. And here's the reason why. It's not saying that your employees are all bad. What it's saying is that one of the biggest misconceptions when you break into a building and you try to accomplish things is people think, okay, the chain of attack is going to be, I do recon, I find a route, I breach, I go straight to the crown jewels. And that's wrong. The vast majority of the time, what's actually going to happen is that you're going to do your recon, you're going to find a route in, you're going to breach, then you're going to immediately start downgrading security and gaining persistence.
Sure.
Because if I can create, once I'm inside the building, if I can create 5, 10, 20 different routes, you are screwed. Because if I have 10 routes, I've downgraded your security in a number of different ways, and I've now created 10 different routes into your building, well, you're never going to get them all. And even if you find one and you fix one, you're not going to find them all. And so now I can come and go as I please, and I can take my time, and I can start doing other things, and it's way, way, way worse for you. So, but that concept of, okay, I have 10 routes into your building. Okay, so I'm in your building. What are we doing now? Insider threat. You have somebody who's inside your building and they want to do bad things. Stop them. But see, that's the problem, right? Is that if you are inside the building, you are effectively an insider threat. So as soon as I find one way into the building, whether it's picking a lock, tailgating, cloning a badge, bypassing building scaling, whatever it is, I find one way into the building, I then immediately start downgrading your security or just finding different routes into the building. And then I can come and go as I please, and as a result, we are now dealing with an insider threat. You've got a guy who's wandering through the building every single day, and he's looking to get access. He's looking to privilege escalate, either laterally or vertically. Well, do you have anything in place to stop your own employees, people who have access to the building, from doing things they shouldn't? And this gets back to the question of, do you know your threats, right? Is it a threat if somebody gets access to the server room? That's usually the one people go with, right? Oh, the server room, the server, that's the big thing. But what about the archive room? What about the board of directors VIP meeting room? What about client meeting rooms? What about the R&D labs? What about like any of these things, right? They all potentially have huge vulnerabilities. What about the lead programmer Bob and his workstation, and if I steal his credentials that he's working on your latest, greatest code, that your company will go under if anything happens to it, or if it's stolen, or if it's given to a competitor. All of these things may be very important to you. And the question then becomes, do you have anything in place right now to stop somebody who already has access to the building from doing all these stupid things?
And, in the context of being done, that's a really good point, because you can check every lock, you can check every door, every this, every that. And it kind of goes back to the example you shared earlier in this podcast of, on Thursday afternoon, you saw this delivery guy come in and he was just, they just let him right in. Well, if that would not have happened during your test, you could never have known. There's so many variables. With people, there are endless variables. How many employees are there? Did they have a good day? Did they have a bad day? I mean, it's really hard to know when to be done when you're dealing with people.
Well, that's sure. So this gets back into take something simple like tailgating, right? Tailgating is just somebody with access walks into a building, you try to follow on their heels and walk behind them. That might work on Monday. But the exact same employee that you try to do that on Thursday, that might fail. They might be in a bad mood. They might be extra vigilant. They might have gotten a reprimand from their supervisor about something. Whatever. But that same person may turn on their heel and stop you. And so when you do successfully social engineer somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have been successful a second time or a third or a fourth or anything else. It also doesn't mean that if employees are savvy enough to not wear their ID badge outside so I can get a picture of it. Okay, but do they always do that? Do they ever slip up? And it's like, yeah, of course they do. Everybody slips up. Everybody has issues. And that's the problem, right? Because like you said, when you're dealing with people, people make mistakes.
And how do you handle that natural inconsistency and difficulty of people in the context of being finished with the job?
Right, exactly, right? So it's very, very hard. So you do your absolute best. And you offer remediations under the assumption that somebody will either go rogue or somebody will take advantage of it. So when you're offering solutions to problems, take credentials, for instance. When you work at a major company, you're usually given a phone and a laptop, right? And that laptop usually has AD credentials, right? I can get onto the Active Directory, I can do whatever. But my credentials do not access your laptop or your phone or your things or your email, right? Employee A does not have access to employee B's stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, you have two people who both have access to the AD, both have access to the laptops, but they cannot go across their thing. But you know what they can both do physically? Go to each other's desks.
Sure.
They can definitely go to each other's desks. They can definitely go to, wherever. And that gets into the other question of, do you have a flat physical network? Do you have a network set up like your building? Is your building set up so that every single person has access to every single location? The archive room, the server room, the VIP meeting room, the client meeting rooms, all these kinds of things. And the answer overwhelmingly is usually yes. And the reason why that is important, to understand why that's such a big deal, imagine if every single employee had access to every single other employee's email, credentials, everything, right? That'd be a mess. That'd be horrible. There's a reason why we don't do that.
Okay, so given all of the different things that make it difficult to know that you're done, from time constraints to client needs to the inconsistencies of people, how do you know when you're done?
Fundamentally, you are done when the engagement contract ends. Like when the engagement contract is over, that you have to be done. But you need to make sure that you are meeting the client's demands, understanding his motivation for why you were there, and putting yourself in the mindset not just of preventing outsider threats, but also insider threats. So when you go through these, try your best. The starting point is identify the client's motivations and what their goals are. Help them to understand what you also think their goals should be in your experience. Do the best that you can under those conditions. And if anything weird comes up or you discover something that the client didn't know about or you didn't know about or anything else, keep constant communication with them. Keep them always in the loop of what you discover, what you're going to try, when you're on site, all of these things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're doing your best. You can never discover everything, but you're going to discover everything you possibly can and prioritize likely attack vectors, both from outsider threats and insider threats.
Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks for that deep dive into knowing when you're done in physical security. And thank you guys for joining us for today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or drop a comment. It helps others discover the show and keeps the conversation going.